Cynthia, which quarterback has the best fantasy matchup for you this week?
Well, it's kind of counterintuitive because this is the game that I think is the most interesting. And the reason I think it's counterintuitive is because both of these teams have been circling this one for a really long time. But Lamar Jackson, for me, against the Chiefs, who are allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. This is going to be a good one because Lamar's ability to earn you those fantasy points using his legs is going to be a key in this matchup. So I think maybe you could even expect, one rushing touchdown.
Well, I'm looking at one of the guys that's going in that Thursday night game coming up, Gardner Minshew. He's been a top 12 quarterback in back-to-back weeks, has a pair of 3 touchdown games. He's not a big-arm guy. Accuracy is more of his strength. He's 3rd in completion percentage over expected, which really is just a fancy next-gen stats way of saying he's hitting his targets at a very high rate, regardless of how much pressure he's seeing or what the circumstances are. He's facing a Dolphins defense giving up about 72% completion percentage and the 3rd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks.
And if you don't want to watch Thursday night, if you want to hold off on Gardner Minshew and you drafted Dak Prescott, stay with him, folks. It's a must start going up against the defense where he's already scoring 30 points a game fantasy-wise. He's throwing up for over 350-plus a game. And that defense in Seattle, it's allowed top 8 fantasy points from the quarterback position in both games this season. Go ahead and go with the quarterback you drafted in Dak Prescott. Let's look over rank at some running backs, starting with the guy that plays with Dak Prescott.
Well, absolutely. I believe that the quarterback and the running back can both have huge games this week against the Seattle Seahawks. Ezekiel Elliott averaging close to 25 fantasy points per game this year. He's touching the ball 27 times a game. And if your guy Dak wouldn't keep stealing these touchdowns from him, he might have a better performance. But this is a good one against the Seahawks, who have allowed the most total yards per game, close to 500. Those Seahawks, not the Seahawks that we remember from the past.
I know after week 1, people sort of freaked out about Austin Eckler. It calmed down somewhat with his week 2 performance, but he's averaging 20 touches per game. You want that sort of opportunity. He's also 6th in the NFL in rushing yards, so maybe we should just pump the brakes a little bit. I know the touchdown numbers aren't what you want, but touchdowns are fickle beasts. He's got a Carolina defense that's allowed a running back to score multiple rushing touchdowns in each of the first 2 games. Start Austin Eckler. By the way, also start Joshua Kelly while you're at it. Both these guys can have big weeks.
Well, talk about someone who's going to have a big week. I think Kenyan Drake is in a situation where this could be his absolute breakout game against the Lions. I would say my Lions, but I'm not sure that they're mine anymore. Ultimately, what I like in this matchup is a game script that favors handing it off to Drake, really seeing what he can do against a defense that's going to allow him to get some vision, meaning going back and forth. We can ask MJD about this, what kind of vision and what kind of opportunity you have running the ball against a Lions defense that looks confused at their linebacker. Second level, not going to be a good situation for the Detroit defense. A good situation for Kenyan Drake, though.
Marcus Grant, what wide receiver, speaking of vision, do you see having a solid matchup here this week?
Oh, I envision big things for scary Terry McLaurin. I mean, we talk about wanting pieces of concentrated passing games, and that's what you got in Washington. I mean, Terry McLaurin has a 27% target share, 34% share of the air yards. I mean, right now, this passing game is mostly McLaurin and Logan Thomas. They get the Browns this week. They've given up 43 points per game to wide receivers. Week 1, it was Marquise Brown with 101 yards. Week 2, it was Tyler Boyd with 72 and a touchdown. I think Terry McLaurin's going to have himself a pretty good week.
Oh, yeah. Terry McLaurin, you want these guys in concentrated roles where they get a lot of targets. And this speaks to DeAndre Hopkins, who I love. He has 36% of the target share in Arizona. That is the most in the NFL. And we were talking about time earlier. I'm old enough to remember when people thought it might be a problem that DeAndre Hopkins was going to Arizona, that he wasn't going to have a relationship with Kyler Murray that was going to lead to such, fruitful fantasy points. But here we are. He's crushing at 25 fantasy points per game this season, and he's got Cynthia's Lions because they're your Lions. If I have to wear the Bears for all these decades, you still got to claim the Lions, and they've allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers this season.
Claiming the Bears and claiming the Lions, that's completely different animals in more ways than one. But I'm looking at Amari Cooper this week, who's kind of quietly had 16-plus fantasy points in both games so far this season. The matchup is great because, Seattle's allowing the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season, a ton, and then 4 top 12 fantasy wide receivers over 2 games. So this is an opportunity for Dak and Amari Cooper to keep the game close, keep that nice Russell Wilson throwing, Dak Prescott throwing. Who's going to catch the balls? Well, Amari Cooper is amongst the wide receivers that will benefit from this.